The first body folded like a discarded napkin at the edge of the dessert table, and Athena's breath left in a single, clean exhale. She stood frozen with a tray of frosted cupcakes balanced on palms that suddenly felt borrowed, the sugar of Margot Hale's pastries gleaming like tiny, obscene jewels while people around them convulsed and fell. There was no slow reveal. Laughter severed. A child's squeal snapped off. Neighbors doubled over. Athena's hands trembled, then steadied with the precise, traitorous steadiness of someone trained to hide what they know. She watched Margot, her mother, the town's public saint of pastries, set down another tray as if arranging grief by color. Athena saw the look on Margot's face. Calm that didn't belong to panic, a small tilt of curiosity that registered like a blade. If this grabbed you, hit like. Subscribe to the Formidable Revenge channel, share, and tell us in the comments, would you bite? Now keep watching. Athena doesn't let anything sleep. Athena's wounds were mapped in neat, exact places. The bankruptcy notice folded into a cookbook drawer. The way committee chairs called her mother "sweet girl" while pocketing praise. The hollow applause when Margot's name was read aloud but never the credit. Those small humiliations sharpened into a lifelong ache. Athena had learned early that kindness could be a leash. Love could mean obedience. Her stakes were not just reputation or bakery receipts. They were the slow erosion of a life built to serve applause while being starved of voice. Connor, bruised, steady, a paramedic with a jaw that refused half pleasures, moved through the chaos like a tether. His hand found Athena's and did not let go. He was not a man who made promises lightly, he made them like anchors. She had begun to trust him in a town that traded trust like cash at a pawn shop. Nobody in Maple Hollow asked why the committee let Margot bake and not lead. People ate the pastries, kissed the hands that made them, then turned away. That omission, that community-wide blindness, became a ledger that Athena kept in her head. Dates, slights, minutes of the meeting where they decided optics over ownership. Each was a tiny, ugly deposit into a pile of unpaid dignity. Today, with sirens turning orchard air into a thrum, the ledger began to look less like paperwork and more like an indictment. The betrayal wasn't theoretical. It snapped into place where sugar met the tongue and life stopped. Athena refused instinctive grief because grief blurred the angles she needed to see. She bent to a fallen woman, eyes narrowed as if cataloging evidence rather than consoling. Margot's hands, calloused, perfect at lifting crusts and calming the restless, folded in front of her like a priest's. Athena's mouth tasted bleach and flour, something that meant she was both inside and outside this moment, watching the scene like a doctor watching a dying patient she could not save. Athena moved like a woman who'd learned survival behind counters and cash registers. Efficient, private, practiced at turning public grief into private fuel. Her wound was not a single night's bruise but a decade of being made expendable. Margot had been a soft-hearted legend, maple-glazed mornings, charity trays, the way people told stories about the bakery as if it were proof that goodness existed. But those tales were sugar-coated versions of a ledger Athena had kept. A dozen occasions where the town's leaders took Margot's labor and turned it into leverage elsewhere. The school culinary program got credit for Margot's recipes. The church sold her pies and promoted the committee chair who never learned to fold a crust. Those public slights became private punishments. Margot, who once hummed in the kitchen, started to speak less and catalog more. Athena's stakes were surgical. Restore truth, survive the public verdict, and carve a space where the living didn't have to apologize for needing more than to be sweet. She could lose everything, her bakery, Connor, the life they were like to build, if the town's attention hardened into condemnation. Her mother's arrest promised ruin, not only prison for Margot, but the bakery's shutter, her reputation burned as collateral. Yet Athena's wound delivered a clarity. If the town would not defend her mother's dignity, she would wrestle that dignity back in whatever theater of consequence remained. Romance in this hour was not soft. Connor's presence was a wire through her. He'd arrived with oxygen masks and calm instructions for triage, then became a human promise. He kept his mouth shut when the press circled. He kept his hands busy when Athena's hands trembled. Their near kiss before the trial had been a necessary theft of normalcy, a private rebellion against a public calamity. He was not a savior, he would never be, but he was a partner who could carry the physical weight of what was necessary, moving bodies, moving evidence, moving Athena through the courthouse and back again. Humiliation played itself out in the media and the pews. The town's whisper network worked like an economy. Favor for favor, silence for silence. People thanked Margot with smiles and then voted to keep her from everything that gave her control. Athena had watched the minutes of meetings, phrases like optics and respectable faces, written in clerical handwriting, dates stamped next to decisions that turned Margot into the town's unpaid contractor. The wounds were both physical, handprints on the bakery's counters, fingerprints in the flour, and social. Gossip that rewired the town's memory so that Margot's labor was public property and her person disposable. Athena had a stake in transforming public shame into public reckoning. She wanted the town to know the cost of their casual cruelties. She wanted the ledger of micro-injustices posted in the light of day, names attached. She wanted the bakery to be hers, not as a legacy of a woman now caged by headlines, but as a space where people could come and be fed without being punished for needing it. This was not merely revenge, it was reclamation. She began to catalog receipts, calendar reminders, who called, who thanked, who never invited. Each entry became a potential testimony. Each testimony could be a blade. The edge she sharpened would demand accountability, and she'd make sure the town lived with the sound of it. The inciting act arrived not as a whisper, but as a public crucifixion. Margot in orange, hands cuffed, the press angle sharp enough to cut. The prosecutor painted a picture of a woman who had weaponized kindness. The courtroom buzzed like trapped flies. Athena watched through a crowd where neighbors pressed forward like vultures at a carcass. The DA dropped evidence like a gauntlet. An unlabeled bag from the pantry, a tray with missing cupcakes, a chemist's dry description of symptoms. No need to name substances. The idea was enough. The town gasped, then chose sides of convenience. People who'd eaten Margot's pies for years lined up to pronounce betrayal, their own hands clean by virtue of forgetting their part. Athena smelled the specifics before the courtroom did. The almond ghost in the air, the way gossip softened to a rumor of intent. She had learned how institutions cover themselves, committees that shuffle blame, meetings that file minutes as armor. The inciting act wasn't only the physical evidence, it was the community's refusal to reckon with the cruelty that had pushed someone to the edge. The betrayal became a public spectacle, and Athena felt the pull between filial loyalty and a clearer, harder truth. She was questioned, pressed, required to stand in a room where her mother's humanity was condensed into charges and legalese. Athena's testimony was surgical. She spoke of morning routines, of orders and deliveries, of a spiral notebook where margins held more than recipes. She admitted the private confession she had long kept, the kitchen nights when Margot whispered that she felt invisible. She watched jurors scratch notes, watched the world compress into a single axis: proof. Their insistence on proof turned the domestic into the forensic, and Athena realized the town wanted a simple villain to point to so they could stop looking at themselves. Outside, the church tent remained cordoned. The town's faces folded into expressions people rehearse for calamity: horror, righteous anger, relief that the wrong person had been found before the town itself might be indicted. Athena felt something inside her break and remold, a relentless intention to make the ledger visible. The act of treachery had been public, raw, and clamorous. Athena's response would have to be louder, smarter, less sentimental. She began to sow traps, legal ones, narrative ones, by leaking the minutes of meetings, by quietly collecting depositions from volunteers, by turning small-town memory into sworn statements. She coaxed witnesses who had been quiet into the light, giving them courage by giving them a place, a table, a bowl of soup, a shoulder, to speak. She didn't lie. She filtered everything through truth, which in a town that loved its myths felt like a scandal. The inciting treachery pushed Athena to the most dangerous edge, confronting the committees who profited from Margot's labor, forcing them into accountability. It was an ugly public ripple. Some townspeople applauded, others recoiled. Athena's plan would not be pretty. It needed to be precisely terrible enough to be believed and merciless enough to be felt. Athena's strategy was surgical, not theatrical. She laid traps like a surgeon sets clamps, quiet, deliberate, designed to stop the bleeding by exposing the wound. She began by posting redacted meeting minutes on the bakery's wall of the living, each entry a breadcrumb. The town read them like gossip. Some scowled, some cried. False leads blossomed in the press, anonymous tips, a disgruntled volunteer pointing fingers, an ex-lover remembered for a decade-old slight. The DA relished the chaos. It was easier to prosecute a reductive narrative than to untangle community complicity. Athena watched false leads sprout and die because she knew how to shepherd attention. She fed truth the way she fed sourdough. Timed, steady, patient. Her traps were not illegal. They were reputational and procedural. She demanded copies of vendor orders, notarized meeting minutes, receipts for the very almond extract the committee insisted on buying for bake-off decorations. She cross-referenced and delivered. Each small proof chipped away at the social architecture that had turned Margot into a public tool. Athena never spoke the word poison. She let the town's fear and the prosecutor's haste do the rest. But she also recruited allies, quiet, willful allies whose lived slights matched her ledger. A teacher who'd been passed over for sports concessions. A volunteer who'd watched Margot's suggestions dismissed. They came forward with names and times, adding texture to what had looked like a lone crime. The pressure mounted. Cameras camped in front of the bakery. Anonymous protests left stale pamphlets and angry notes. Connor's shifts became longer, his texts shorter. He held Athena in the small hours when she could not sleep, his presence a slow, necessary pressure that kept her from cracking. Yet even as she gathered proofs, the town offered up distractions. A viral theory that someone had intentionally sabotaged the committee's reputation. A blogger framing Margot as a martyr used by social media. Athena watched these false leads like thorns and used them. She fed a rumor to a reporter to smoke out the source of a forged receipt. She leaked an innocuous draft email to prompt someone to contradict it on record. Each baited line reeled in the people who thought they could protect themselves by aligning with easier stories. Then came the worst false lead, a local man. Once bitter at Margot for refusing him credit on a recipe, went on air, tearful and apologetic, and claimed he'd seen Margot in the pantry late with a friend. The statement looked damning, and the DA paraded it under the court's lights. Athena felt the plan wobble. She could smell collapse like metal heating in a forge. Her traps had to adapt. She began to shift from exposure to rescue. Evidence that seemed to implicate turned into a net that caught the flimsy threads the DA relied on, timestamps that contradicted alibis, lists of deliveries that showed the man's claim was impossible. She forced the court to see the difference between rumor and corroboration. Every time a false lead hissed into view, Athena matched it with a paper trail, an eyewitness, or a ledger entry. The town's breath shortened. The courtroom's rhythm stuttered. At the trial's midpoint, Athena sat and watched a photograph projected on the courtroom screen, a seemingly mundane snapshot of a church social the week before. On it, Margot smiled like she always did, but a careful eye could see the committee's faces arranged nearby. Marla, Porter, names Athena had inked into her ledger, smiling with the kind of satisfaction people reserve for getting away with something. The DA presented a new layer, the minutes that showed the committee had systematically redirected leadership, quietly delegating authority while keeping the public gratitude for themselves. The betrayal revealed at the midpoint was not a single explosive confession, but a structural corruption. The town had long been siphoning Margot's contributions into prestige for others. The social humiliation had become the motive. This revelation shifted public perception. It was no longer about an isolated act of cruelty from Margot. It was about a town that nurtured a culture where someone like Margot could be rendered invisible and finally refuse the erasure. Athena felt vindicated and hollow at once. Vindicated because the ledger had teeth now. Hollow because the truth revealed the scale of complicity she'd been fighting. The courtroom murmured. Some jurors stared as if realizing the town had been in denial. But the midpoint betrayal forced Athena to reveal her hand in ways she hadn't planned. She volunteered minutes, chain of custody notes, and vendor invoices. She testified with the kind of cold clarity that cut both ways, clear enough to be believed, blunt enough to be punished for. She named names, attached dates, explained context. The prosecutor's smile tightened. The defense's face set into the strain of a woman trying to save a life from legal death. Margot's eyes softened when Athena said aloud what she'd thought about for years. They kept my mother baking but kept her out of the room where decisions were made. The town's anger transmuted. Citizens who'd condemned her mother now whispered words that sounded like regret. Some avoided Athena's gaze altogether. The discovery at the midpoint made the trial less about motive and more about accountability. Athena's ledger morphed into judicial leverage. The community's casual cruelties were now visible in court exhibits. The prosecutor tried to spin the narrative back to intention, to a single act of malice, but Athena's testimony insisted on a broader moral frame. When a community fails someone repeatedly, when it uses labor and refuses dignity, it bears a collective responsibility for the consequences. The midpoint betrayal exposed the town's moral bankruptcy and forced people to choose sides. Friendships frayed. Fundraisers were quietly canceled. The bakery's wall of living filled with more index cards, confessions, and recipes from people who had once stood on the sidelines. Athena built from truth. But the world wasn't a courtroom. It was a pressure cooker. The darkest hour arrived like a rumor that won't be stopped. A key witness recanted on the stand, citing fear and social ostracism. The DAs lined up witnesses. Volunteers who'd agreed to corroborate Athena's minutes began to withdraw. Something had frayed in the town's tapestry. Threats, late-night calls, shadowed visits. Athena watched the defense stitch doubt into the fabric of the trial, turning clear testimony into muddy water. Her strategy of exposure, which had seemed unstoppable, began to look brittle under the weight of human fear. Simultaneously, the bakery was vandalized. Someone spray-painted symbols on the back door. A tray of Orion's special bread was ruined in the night. The town's anonymous cruelty escalated into targeted harassment. Connor caught one of the boys who'd been seen lurking and chased him off. The boy's mother apologized with a stare that avoided true repentance. Athena's staff dwindled as volunteers who feared association quietly resigned. The witness kitchen lost donations. The wall of living went quiet, as if the town were holding its breath. Inside the courtroom, the jury's faces hardened into something Athena couldn't read. The defense painted Margot as a broken woman who had snapped, and some jurors seemed to prefer simple answers. The pressure that had once been external began to turn inward. Athena doubted her own choices. Had she misread the town? Had she become the hammer she'd sworn not to be? The ledger she'd kept, once a map to justice, felt like a weapon that might injure the living more than it saved them. Personal betrayals compounded the legal ones. One of Athena's closest allies, a baker who'd promised to testify about committee meetings, was caught on a live stream, laughing with the committee chair at a fundraiser. The footage made it seem like a conspiracy that included even those who'd offered support. Athena's phone lit with threatening messages. She locked its screen and watched the bakery doors like a woman waiting for a storm to break. Then came the worst collapse. Detective Ford, whose dispassionate face had been a constant, called Athena and asked her to step back from public actions. He'd been told to lay low by superiors worried about community stability. He sounded tired and constrained in a way Athena had never heard before. The legal net she'd woven threatened to unravel under institutional caution. Where Athena needed constancy, she found equivocation. Her plan, meticulous, righteous, patient, looked like it might fail. The chair of the committee publicly apologized in a framed statement and then disappeared into silence, refusing to testify. The DA's energy shifted away from the structural questions Athena had opened and back toward a narrow, prosecutable narrative. Athena felt the world tilt. The ledger, once a tool of moral arithmetic, became a liability. In that darkest hour, Athena sat alone in the bakery, the ovens cold, the wall of living dim. She thought of Margot behind county glass, unblinking, and felt rage and grief knead into a new shape. If the law would not hold the town accountable, Athena told herself, then she would force a different kind of accounting. The plan had collapsed, but collapse breeds new forms. She would not go down with a broken strategy. She would remake the game entirely. When the courtroom's momentum faltered, Athena stopped trying to win the trial in the way the DA wanted and pivoted to a different battlefield, the town's conscience. She realized the jury could be swayed by cold facts, but the town couldn't be healed by facts alone. It required sustained pressure and the creation of a space where the living could feel seen. So Athena turned the bakery into a public theater of testimony. She reopened the witness kitchen with a new rule: no sermons, just stories and meals. People came first out of hunger, then curiosity, then debt of conscience. Her turning point wasn't theatrical. No grand reveal at noon on the courthouse steps. It was patient intimidation, a slow unspooling of public memory, stitched together by those who had once been afraid. She invited the teacher, the volunteer, the retired councilman who'd once shrugged off a suggestion. She offered bread and a microphone. She framed it as a simple thing: tell the truth in public. The effect was contagious. Once one voice pierced the hush, others followed. Where the courtroom required evidence to be filed and sealed, the kitchen required honesty. The testimonies were messy, incomplete, human, and brutally effective. She amplified these sessions. Athena recorded them, then redacted names where necessary, and distributed clips to local radio and social feeds. The narrative shifted from a single act to a pattern of behavior. The town's myth cracked. People saw themselves on stage, confessing and repenting. Some resisted, of course. Old power never surrenders gently. But the pressure was now cultural, rather than purely legal. Athena employed small public reckonings, naming the dates, posting the minutes in full, organizing community forums that focused less on blame and more on structural change. She refused to let the scandal be reduced to a villain and kept pushing for the ledger's truth. This clarity also arrived in the form of evidence the DA had overlooked: a supplier's invoice misfiled and a surveillance timestamp that contradicted the recanted witness. Athena had quietly chased down the source, not for spectacle, but to close gaps. She presented it not to inflame, but to force the court to reevaluate. The DA reopened a few lines of inquiry. Detective Ford, freed from bureaucratic cautions by a new public pressure wave, moved with renewed intent. On a small, decisive morning, Athena met with Camille, the public defender who had always handled Margot's case with the weary tenderness of someone who saw both the accused and the town as casualties. Camille slid a sheaf of unsigned letters across the table, each one from people who'd been too ashamed to speak until now. One by one, Camille said. Athena nodded. She would not let silence be their grammar any longer. The turning point culminated in a public post on the bakery's board, a transparent list of the committee's minutes, unredacted where possible, and an invitation to anyone wronged to add their account. People came. The kitchen filled, not with victims waiting for pity, but with citizens who wanted to name the small cruelties that had accumulated into catastrophe. Athena saw the difference in Connor's face, the worry easing into determination. They were no longer only fighting to save Margot, they were fighting to awaken a town. I arranged the confrontation like a baker arranges ingredients, precisely with an eye for the moment when heat transforms structure. She collaborated with Camille and Detective Ford to force a hearing that held both legal teeth and public theater. The courtroom filled with people who'd once whispered in grocery aisles and PTA lines. Cameras packed the benches. The prosecutor, sensing both risk and opportunity, brought forward the new evidence Athena had uncovered: supplier timestamps, emails, and surveillance timestamps that undercut the recanted witness's story. But Athena's real coup was the public testimony she'd curated outside the courtroom. The kitchen confessions, live-streamed and archived, each a human counterweight to the defense's narrative. The first shock came when Marla, the committee chair who'd always been immaculate in public, walked into the courtroom and sat deliberately in the front row. She had been the face of the town's refusal to award leadership to Margot. The second shock arrived minutes later. Porter, a taciturn city councilman, walked in clutching a stack of minutes and, without preamble, handed them to the clerk. He'd been the one to write the phrases, "keep her busy" and "presentable faces only." The room inhaled. Athena had anticipated denial. She'd not anticipated submission. Porter's confession was ugly and unadorned. He admitted to steering opportunities away from Margot for the sake of optics, to treating her labor as a commodity. He spoke the words Athena had written in her ledger with a voice that quavered but held. As Porter testified, an undercurrent shifted. People who had dutifully nodded at committee decisions now watched a man explain why he made them. The prosecutor added the document the committee had tried to bury. The judge, who had been conservative in his orders, allowed the minute's entry as context for motive. The defense scrambled. They argued irrelevance. Athena's jaw tightened as she watched them try to reduce the confession to embarrassment rather than accountability. Then came the final twist. A lab tech called to the stand contradicted the earlier implication that a single, clear toxin had been used as an instrument of murder in an obvious, repeatable way. She described contamination patterns, cross-reactions in kitchen environments where many things could concentrate symptoms. She refused to give the sensational soundbite the tabloids wanted. The room expected clarity. Instead, it got complexity. The prosecutor's case, which had been building toward a simple narrative of intentional mass harm, now had to account for the town's negligence, for missing oversight, for treating a public right to leadership as if it were a privilege. Athena watched both triumph and peril unfold. Porter's confession opened a wider moral indictment but didn't necessarily secure a different criminal verdict. The courtroom now wrestled with the uncomfortable truth that the crime was both individual and communal. The climax wasn't a single cinematic gavel. It was the convergence of legal pressure, public confession, and sustained cultural accountability. Athena felt the triumph of having forced a town to look in the mirror, and the tragedy that justice in court might still fail to fully account for lives stolen. In the end, the jury's decision was less a clean string of answers and more a stain on the town's conscience. Guilty for some counts, not guilty for others, with civil investigations promised. The verdict landed with the weight of a bell. People wept, some in relief, some in grief. Athena had delivered a reckoning that was neither total victory nor total defeat. It was a hard, necessary truth. The aftermath was a landscape of repairs rather than a neat restoration. Some wanted vengeance, others wanted to forget. Athena chose a different currency: continuity. She reopened the witness kitchen with rules solid as bread dough. Pay what you can, eat if you can't, tell what you must. The town's ledger moved from accusation to repair. Porter's public contrition translated into funding for leadership scholarships in the culinary program, forced into existence by both shame and necessity. The program bore Athena's name on the first plaque, not as triumphalism, but as a reminder that work could be redirected toward justice. Margot served sentences not only to state institutions, but to private reckonings. She sat in county visiting rooms, a small presence wearing a hairpin Athena once gifted her. Their conversations were not full of absolution. They were brutally honest exchanges about the cost of humiliation and the ways love can both heal and suffocate. Athena visited, bringing slices of bread rather than sententious explanations. They spoke in recipes, timing, temperature, because it was the language they both still understood. Romance settled into its own rhythm. Connor stayed, not as a rescuer, but as a partner who could shoulder the grief and the mundane work of life. They held the bakery's front together, a counter, pastries, and quiet. Some nights they lay awake and rehearsed the faces of the dead. Other nights they smoked on the back stoop, laughing at old jokes like contraband. Their love was neither melodrama nor redemption. It was companionship stitched to duty. The town changed in increments. Some people left, unable to carry the memory. Others returned, bringing casseroles and apologies written on index cards, signed with names that carried weight. The witness kitchen became a place where stories were traded for food and truth, balanced with mercy. The wall of living filled with recipes and confessions, each card an instrument of remembrance and repair. Justice had been imperfect. The trial had not erased the dead. The jury's mixed verdict left some families dissatisfied. Athena knew vengeance could never stitch bone or bring back voices, but she had forced public recognition of a pattern that had allowed cruelty to fester. The ledger's exposure yielded structural changes. Minutes no longer disappeared into private drawers. The church committee reformed with diverse leadership. The culinary program taught not just technique, but agency. Athena kept a small thing in her apron pocket, a faded pastel napkin from the day the first person fell. She touched it sometimes when sleep didn't come. It reminded her that revenge had not been the sole aim. Accountability and repair had been. On the first anniversary, the bakery pressed 50 loaves stamped with names into hands that trembled. People warmed slices and sat together. Some wept. Some forgave. Some scrubbed dishes at the kitchen sink and said, "We'll do better." The ending is a ledger closed in part and open in others, triumphant because a town was forced to reckon, tragic because consequence is never perfect justice, and morally gray because Athena's strategies required cruelty and cunning in service of a higher truth. She had paid with sleepless nights and fractured friendships. She had won a new kind of stewardship. I stood at the window as dusk settled, flour on her knuckles, Connor's hand resting at the small of her back. She had reclaimed sweetness without letting it be blinding. In Maple Hollow, the smell of bread rose again, complex, honest, and warning the town that the price of taking a person's life, dignity, or labor was a cost they would now reckon with, meal after meal.